The billionaire stood frozen in the doorway of the shelter, his Italian leather shoes collecting dust from the cracked linoleum floor, staring at the fragile 13-year-old girl with his daughter's emerald eyes, who was supposed to be living in the penthouse he'd paid for, his granddaughter, the sole heir to a $2 million trust fund he'd established the day she was born. The shelter director's weathered hand rested protectively on the child's bony shoulder, her torn sneakers and threadbare clothing telling a story that contradicted every bank statement, every wire transfer, every certified letter his lawyers had sent to ensure her future. When he asked about the trust fund, the carefully structured account that should have been providing $15,000 monthly for her care, education, and comfort, the stepmother's name surfaced like oil on poisoned water. But the truth behind those missing millions would unravel a deception so calculated, so breathtaking in its audacity, that everyone who heard it would question how deeply evil could hide behind a loving smile. What had the stepmother done with money meant to protect an orphaned child? How had a girl born into wealth ended up in a homeless shelter eating donated soup? And why had no one noticed until it was almost too late? William Hartford had built his empire on attention to detail, but the one detail that haunted him every night was the absence of his granddaughter from his life, a void created 3 years earlier when his daughter Rebecca died in the car accident that shattered their family into jagged, unrepairable pieces. The lawyers had assured him that Lily, sweet, artistic Lily with her mother's laugh and his own stubborn determination, was being cared for by her stepmother Patricia, the woman his daughter had married just 2 years before the tragedy. The trust fund he'd established would ensure Lily wanted for nothing, but the quarterly reports showed only routine expenditures, and Patricia's occasional emails contained cheerful updates about private schools, music lessons, and family vacations that seemed to justify every penny withdrawn. The chance encounter at Morrison Street Shelter happened because William's car had broken down 6 blocks away, forcing him to walk through a neighborhood his driver usually navigated around, past boarded-up storefronts and sidewalks cratered with potholes that swallowed rainwater like hungry mouths. He ducked into the shelter merely to call for assistance, but his eyes found her immediately, a thin girl sitting alone at a corner table, methodically eating watery vegetable soup while sketching something in a battered notebook, her posture rigid with the kind of dignity that poverty tries to steal but sometimes strengthens instead. The birthmark on her left wrist, a small crescent moon that Rebecca had called Lily's lucky mark, confirmed what his heart already knew. But the reality before him contradicted everything his financial advisors had reported, every assurance Patricia had provided, every assumption he'd made about his granddaughter's well-being. Lily's jeans had holes that weren't fashionable but necessary. Her jacket bore stains that spoke of weeks without proper washing, and her eyes carried shadows that childhood should never hold. Lily? His voice cracked around her name, decades of boardroom composure dissolving into grandfather's grief. The girl's head snapped up, the pencil falling from fingers that trembled like leaves in a storm, recognition and fear warring across her gaunt features. Grandpa William? The shelter director, a woman named Maria Rodriguez, who'd spent 20 years witnessing human suffering in its countless variations, moved instinctively between them, protective but uncertain. "Do you know this man, sweetheart?" Lily nodded slowly, but her eyes darted toward the door as if calculating escape routes, a habit that spoke volumes about the life she'd been living. "He's my grandfather, but I thought Patricia said you didn't want to see me anymore, that you blamed me for Mom dying." The words hit William like physical blows, each syllable revealing layers of manipulation he hadn't imagined possible, but he forced himself to breathe through the rage building in his chest like a thunderstorm gathering strength. "That's not true, Lily. I've been sending money for you every month, $15,000. Where is Patricia now?" "I don't know." Lily's voice barely rose above a whisper, her fingers twisting the frayed edge of her sleeve into tight spirals. "She dropped me here 2 weeks ago, said she needed to go on a business trip, but she never came back. The shelter tried calling her number, but it's disconnected." Maria's expression hardened into professional concern, her hand finding the phone at her desk with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Hartford, we need to contact Child Services immediately. This child has been abandoned." The next hours blurred into a nightmare of bureaucracy and revelation. Social workers documenting Lily's condition, while William's lawyers began the forensic excavation of the trust fund accounts, their findings emerging like artifacts from a deliberately obscured crime scene. The $2 million he'd carefully invested and structured, the fortune meant to guarantee his granddaughter's security through college, through early adulthood, through whatever challenges life presented, had been systematically drained over 3 years through a sophisticated network of shell companies, fraudulent invoices, and forged authorization documents. Patricia Morrison, or whatever her real name was, because the private investigators were already discovering that her identity had more layers than an onion, had apparently planned the entire deception from the moment she'd met Rebecca at a charity gala 4 years earlier. The marriage had been a carefully orchestrated con, the trust fund her actual target, and Rebecca's death, while officially ruled accidental, now demanded reinvestigation. "She used to be nice," Lily said quietly that evening, sitting in William's study, wrapped in one of the cashmere blankets he'd ordered his housekeeper to bring. Her hands clutching a mug of hot chocolate, she sipped with the slow reverence of someone unaccustomed to small luxuries. "Right after Mom died, Patricia seemed like she really cared. She'd make my favorite meals, help with homework, even took me to the art supply store to buy new paints. But then things changed." "When?" William asked gently, though every cell in his body screamed for vengeance against the woman who'd stolen 3 years from both of them. "About 6 months after the funeral." Lily's eyes grew distant, focusing on memories that clearly brought pain. "She started getting phone calls she'd take in another room, but I could hear her laughing in a way she never laughed with me, this mean, sharp sound. Then she told me we needed to tighten our belts, that the trust fund wasn't producing as much as expected. We moved from the nice apartment to a smaller place, then to an even smaller one. My private school became public school. Then I just stopped going because we kept moving and she never registered me anywhere." The trust fund statements told a different story, one of extravagant withdrawals categorized as educational expenses and medical care and housing costs. But the investigators were tracing those funds to luxury condos in Miami, a sports car registered under an alias, and what appeared to be payments to a boyfriend Patricia had maintained throughout the marriage. The $2 million had become $1 million, then $500,000, then nothing, all while Lily's world contracted into poverty and neglect. Part 2. The Unraveling. The media discovered the story within 48 hours because scandals involving billionaires and missing money spread through news cycles like wildfire through dry grass. But William's PR team managed to keep Lily's face out of the cameras while the investigators built their case. Patricia's trail led to the Cayman Islands, then to Monaco, and finally to a villa in southern Portugal, where she was living under the name Victoria Ashford with a man 20 years her junior, posting Instagram photos of champagne brunches and sunset yacht parties, funded entirely by money stolen from an orphaned child. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning, Portuguese authorities coordinating with Interpol to intercept Patricia as she returned from her morning Pilates class, her designer workout clothes and flawless manicure presenting a stark contrast to the images of Lily in the shelter that investigators had documented. The extradition process would take months, but William's lawyers were simultaneously filing civil suits to recover whatever assets remained, though they warned him that most of the money had been spent, gambled away, or hidden in accounts they might never find. I should have checked, William told his attorney, the guilt settling into his bones like cold rain. I should have visited, should have demanded to see her in person, should have trusted my instincts when something felt wrong. She was careful, the attorney replied, spreading documents across the conference table that showed the elaborate paper trail Patricia had constructed. She sent you those emails from Lily's account, created fake school reports, even hired someone to answer the phone number you had on file and pretend to be the school secretary. This was professional-level fraud, William. You couldn't have known. But knowing that intellectually didn't ease the emotional weight of 3 lost years, the birthdays he'd missed, the trauma Lily had endured, or the fundamental betrayal of trust that Patricia had orchestrated from the moment she'd entered their lives. The investigators were now examining Rebecca's accident with new scrutiny, analyzing brake line failures and the convenient timing of Patricia's alibi, though proving murder after 3 years would be nearly impossible without a confession. Lily, meanwhile, was slowly adjusting to life in William's estate, her initial wariness gradually melting as she realized this safety was real and permanent. But the nights brought terrors that jolted her awake, screaming about being abandoned, about being worthless, about all the poison Patricia had dripped into her mind alongside the financial theft. The therapist William hired specialized in childhood trauma, her gentle approaches helping Lily process not just the recent abandonment, but the grief she'd never properly addressed over losing her mother. "She told me Mom would be ashamed of me," Lily admitted during one of their late-night conversations, sitting on the window seat in her new bedroom overlooking the garden that was slowly being restored to the wild beauty Rebecca had loved. "She said that's why you didn't visit, because I was disappointing, because I wasn't smart or pretty enough to matter to anyone." William felt his heart fracture anew, the calculated cruelty of Patricia's psychological abuse matching the financial crimes in terms of damage inflicted. "Your mother loved you more than anything in this world, Lily, and I stayed away because I was told you needed space to grieve, that my presence reminded you too painfully of what you'd lost. I should have questioned that, should have insisted, but I thought I was respecting your needs. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." The tears came then for both of them, releasing 3 years of accumulated grief, rage, and loss into the quiet sanctuary of that bedroom, where family began the slow, painful process of reconstruction. Part 3. The Reckoning. The trial, when it finally began 8 months later, became a media sensation that exposed not just Patricia's crimes, but the systemic failures that had allowed them to continue unchecked. The quarterly trust reviews that no one had properly audited, the lack of mandatory in-person verification for minor beneficiaries, and the ease with which a skilled con artist could manipulate systems designed to protect wealth rather than children. Patricia sat in the defendant's chair wearing a demure gray suit chosen by her public defender, her expression shifting between remorseful tears and icy calculation depending on who was watching, but the evidence was overwhelming. Financial experts testified about the shell companies and fraudulent documents, but the moment that broke the courtroom's composure came when Lily herself took the stand, her voice steady despite trembling hands, describing the progression from subtle neglect to outright abandonment. She recounted meals skipped so Patricia could afford another designer handbag, winters spent in apartments where the heat was turned off to save money that never benefited Lily, and the final betrayal of being left at the shelter with nothing but a garbage bag of clothes and a promise to return that everyone knew was a lie. "Did you ever ask your stepmother about the trust fund your grandfather established?" the prosecutor asked gently. Lily nodded, her fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand. "Once, when I was cold and hungry, and we'd been evicted again, I asked if Grandpa's money could help. She laughed and said I was too stupid to understand finance, that the money was being properly managed, and that I should be grateful she hadn't put me in foster care, where I'd be abused and forgotten. The jury's faces hardened, the 12 men and women who would decide Patricia's fate, clearly unmoved by her defense team's attempts to paint her as a grieving widow who'd made poor financial decisions under stress. The prosecution presented evidence of premeditation, of research Patricia had conducted into trust fund structures before even meeting Rebecca, of similar cons she'd attempted under different names in other states, and of the calculated way she'd isolated Lily from every support system that might have exposed the truth. Rebecca's accident received its own examination, accident reconstruction experts testifying that the brake line failure showed signs of deliberate tampering, but without physical evidence. The car had been destroyed in the crash and subsequent fire. Criminal charges for murder couldn't be sustained. Still, the implication hung in the courtroom air like smoke, adding moral weight to the financial crimes that carried their own substantial penalties. The verdict came on a Friday afternoon. Guilty on all counts of fraud, embezzlement, child endangerment, and identity theft, with sentencing scheduled for the following month. Patricia's mask finally cracked as the jury foreman read each guilty verdict, her face contorting with rage as she screamed accusations at William, at Lily, at the judge, claiming she deserved that money for putting up with Rebecca's moods and Lily's needs, revealing the contempt she'd hidden behind practiced smiles for 4 years. The sentence, when delivered, totaled 32 years in federal prison, though the judge noted that no amount of incarceration could restore what Patricia had stolen, not just money, but childhood, security, and the precious years of a grandfather-granddaughter relationship that could never be recovered. Part 4. The healing recovery, William learned, wasn't a destination but a journey measured in small victories and occasional setbacks. Lily's progress tracked not by dramatic breakthroughs, but by quiet moments of growing trust. She started at a new school where her artistic talent found encouragement, her sketches evolving from dark, haunted images to pieces that captured light and hope in equal measure. The trust fund, or what remained of it, after Patricia's spending spree, was being rebuilt through William's personal resources and the partial asset recovery his lawyers had managed, but he added safeguards that his previous arrangements had lacked: mandatory in-person meetings, independent oversight, and ironclad provisions that prioritized Lily's direct well-being over any guardian's access. The shelter where he'd found her received a substantial donation. William's gratitude for Maria Rodriguez's protection of his granddaughter, manifesting in a new wing dedicated to family reunification services and legal advocacy for abandoned children. Maria attended the opening ceremony, pulling William aside to say something that shifted his perspective on the entire nightmare they'd endured. "You know what Lily told me the day before you found her?" Maria asked, her eyes bright with tears that spoke to the emotional toll of her work. She said she was praying for a miracle, not for money or comfort, but just for someone to see her, really see her, and remember she was worth loving. You answered that prayer, William. Don't let the years you lost overshadow the decades you've gained. The wisdom in those words helped William release some of the crushing guilt he carried, redirecting that energy toward building the future rather than mourning the past. He and Lily established new traditions: Sunday morning walks through the garden, Friday movie nights where she controlled the remote, and monthly adventure days where they explored museums, parks, or whatever destination caught Lily's increasingly confident imagination. The lost years couldn't be recovered, but each new memory helped heal the wounds Patricia had inflicted. Lily's therapy sessions grew less frequent as her nightmares diminished, her therapist noting the remarkable resilience children could demonstrate when given genuine safety and unconditional love, but certain triggers remained. References to being abandoned, to being unwanted, or to people lying about caring could still send her spiraling into panic, each episode a reminder that healing wasn't linear or complete. The The civil case against Patricia resulted in a judgment for the full $2 million plus punitive damages and interest, bringing the total to nearly $4 million. But collecting from someone serving 32 years in prison proved predictably difficult. Still, every asset the investigators found, the Miami condo sold at auction, the sports car seized and liquidated, even the designer clothes and jewelry cataloged and sold, returned something to the account that would fund Lily's college education and beyond. Part 5. The Revelation. The final shock came 18 months after Patricia's conviction, delivered via a letter from the prison where she was serving her sentence, the envelope addressed to William but clearly intended to wound rather than reconcile. Inside, written in Patricia's precise handwriting, was a confession that answered the question investigators had never quite resolved. "You want to know if I killed Rebecca?" The letter read, each word chosen for maximum impact. "I didn't tamper with her brakes, but I didn't need to. I knew she was taking those anxiety medications that made her drowsy, knew she'd been drinking wine that evening, knew the route she'd take home from your house would include that dangerous curve near the ravine. I called her as she drove, told her I'd found messages between you and some woman, a complete lie, knowing her emotional reaction would distract her at exactly the wrong moment. I heard the crash through the phone, heard the screams, and I hung up and waited for the call that would make me a wealthy widow. Except the trust fund was in Lily's name, not mine, so I had to get creative. You can't prove any of this, of course, and I'll deny it if you try to use this letter in court. But I wanted you to know that I won, William. Maybe not the money, but I took 4 years of your granddaughter's life, implanted doubts and fears that will haunt her forever, and destroyed your daughter from beyond the grave. That's power you can't take away from me, no matter how many years I spend in here." The letter's cruelty was breathtaking, but William recognized it for what it was: a final, desperate attempt by a narcissist to maintain relevance and control from behind bars. He consulted with Lily's therapist about whether to share the contents, ultimately deciding that Lily deserved truth over comfortable fiction, but delivered with context and support. "She's trying to hurt us one last time," William explained, sitting beside Lily in the garden where Rebecca's roses were finally blooming again after years of neglect. "But knowing the truth means she can't surprise us anymore. Her power is gone." Lily read the letter silently, tears streaming down her face, but when she finished, she did something William didn't expect. She laughed, a sound sharp with pain but also liberation. "She wants me to be haunted forever, but I'm not. I'm here, I'm loved, and I have a future she tried to steal but couldn't destroy. That makes me the winner, not her." The prosecutors used the letter to trigger a new investigation into Rebecca's death, Patricia's admission of intentional distraction while driving potentially qualifying as criminally negligent homicide, but the statute of limitations and the difficulty of proving intent without additional evidence made conviction unlikely. Still, the moral weight of the truth settled over Patricia's legacy, transforming her from con artist into something darker, and ensuring that her name would be forever associated with calculated evil rather than simple greed. Epilogue. The Legacy. 3 years after finding Lily in that shelter, William stood in an art gallery showcasing his granddaughter's first professional exhibition, her paintings, luminous works exploring themes of loss, survival, and redemption, drawing crowds and critical acclaim that had nothing to do with her grandfather's money or influence. At 16, Lily had transformed her trauma into art that spoke to others who'd endured abandonment, abuse, or betrayal, her artist's statement dedicating the collection to everyone who's ever felt invisible but refused to disappear. The trust fund, fully restored and enhanced by William's contributions, now sat untouched, except for reasonable educational expenses, Lily having insisted on working part-time jobs to pay for her art supplies and personal expenses, her independence hard-won and fiercely protected. She'd forgiven Patricia, not because the woman deserved forgiveness, but because carrying hatred was exhausting and counterproductive, though she'd also made clear she would never visit the prison or acknowledge any future attempts at contact. William's relationship with his granddaughter had become the center of his semi-retirement, board meetings and business decisions, increasingly secondary to school plays, art shows, and the simple joy of family dinners where they argued about politics, laughed at terrible jokes, and built the bond that Patricia had tried so hard to prevent. The lost years still ached sometimes, appearing in moments when he calculated Lily's age and realized how much of her childhood existed only in photographs he'd never seen. But Maria's wisdom had proven true. The decades gained mattered more than the years lost. The reforms William had pushed for in trust fund oversight had resulted in new legislation requiring in-person verification of minor beneficiaries and independent advocacy for orphaned heirs, changes that might prevent future Patricia Morrisons from exploiting vulnerable children. The Morrison Street Shelter, renamed the Rebecca Hartford Family Center in honor of his daughter, had become a model for reunification services that had helped dozens of families find each other again. And Lily, standing before her paintings in a dress she'd chosen herself, neither too expensive nor too cheap, but exactly right for who she was becoming, looked at William with Rebecca's eyes and said something that made every nightmare worth enduring. "Thank you for seeing me, Grandpa. Thank you for remembering I was worth finding." In that moment, William understood that Patricia's greatest failure hadn't been getting caught or going to prison, but fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of wealth. Money could be stolen, spent, or recovered, but the love between a grandfather and granddaughter, once found, once acknowledged, once properly valued, was a fortune no con artist could touch. A trust fund that would pay dividends for the rest of their lives, and a legacy that would outlast every prison sentence Patricia would ever serve. The billionaire who'd found his granddaughter in a shelter that terrible morning had asked about a $2 million trust fund and discovered a theft that shocked everyone. But the real discovery was something infinitely more valuable: the unbreakable resilience of family and the truth that some things, once nearly lost, become treasured beyond all measure when finally reclaimed. 20 years later, the Foundation's annual gala had grown from a modest fundraiser into one of Manhattan's most anticipated charitable events. But Lily Hartford Chen refused to let the glamour overshadow the purpose, her opening speech always beginning with the photograph projected behind her, a gaunt 13-year-old girl in threadbare clothes sitting in a shelter, clutching a sketchpad like a lifeline. The image still had power to silence a room full of donors in designer gowns and custom tuxedos, reminding them that the children they were funding tonight existed not as statistics or tax deductions, but as human beings, one catastrophe away from invisibility. "That girl believed she was worthless," Lily said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd transformed pain into purpose. Her stepmother had stolen her inheritance, abandoned her in a homeless shelter, and spent 3 years convincing her that nobody cared whether she lived or died. But one person refused to accept her disappearance: my grandfather, who found me that day and asked one simple question that changed everything. "Where is the money that should be protecting you?" William Hartford sat in the front row, his 89 years evident in the silver hair and the cane resting against his chair, but his eyes remained sharp as he watched his granddaughter command the stage with the confidence that had taken years to build. Beside him sat Lily's husband David and their 7-year-old twins, Emma and Rebecca, named for the grandmother they'd never met, but whose story lived on through family tradition and the carefully preserved paintings that lined the Hartford Estates gallery. The Rebecca Hartford Foundation, which Lily now directed while maintaining her career as an internationally exhibited artist, had rescued over 3,000 children from situations mirroring her own. Exploited heirs, abandoned beneficiaries, and kids whose trust funds had been systematically looted by the very guardians meant to protect them. The reforms William had fought for 2 decades earlier had been strengthened and expanded, mandatory advocacy now built into every significant inheritance involving minors. But the foundation existed because legislation alone couldn't catch every predator or prevent every betrayal. The money Patricia stole was eventually recovered and restored, Lily continued, gesturing to the financial transparency reports distributed to every attendee. But the 3 years she took can never be returned. That's why this foundation focuses not just on financial recovery, but on healing, therapy, education, family reunification, and long-term support that acknowledges trauma doesn't end when the court case closes. The evening's keynote speaker was Maria Rodriguez, now retired from shelter work but serving on the foundation's board, her presence a reminder of the frontline workers who often provided the first lifeline to children in crisis. She shared stories of recent cases, a 9-year-old boy whose uncle had embezzled his parents' life insurance, a teenage girl whose guardian had forced her to work 16-hour days while stealing her wages, twins whose grandmother had sold their inheritance to fund a gambling addiction, each story ending with intervention, recovery, and the slow rebuilding of shattered trust. The gala raised $14 million that night, but the moment that brought William to tears came during the silent auction, when Emma, his great-granddaughter who'd inherited Lily's artistic talent and Rebecca's fearless spirit, presented him with a painting she'd created specifically for the event. The canvas showed a man in expensive shoes standing in a shabby shelter doorway, his hand extended toward a small girl surrounded by light. The composition capturing not the rescue itself, but the moment just before when everything could still have gone wrong, but didn't. "It's called The Finding," Emma explained with 7-year-old solemnity, her fingers paint-stained despite her velvet dress. "Mommy says you saved her, but she says she saved you too, from a life of only having money instead of having family. Is that true, Great-Grandpa?" William pulled his great-granddaughter into an embrace that felt like completing a circle that had been broken and reformed and strengthened through the breaking. "That's exactly true, sweetheart. The best investment I ever made was refusing to stop looking." Later that night, after the crowds had departed and the caterers had cleared the last champagne flutes, William stood with Lily in the Foundation's Hall of Advocates, a corridor lined with photographs of every child they'd helped, faces that would have remained lost without intervention. Some of the kids in those photos were now adults themselves, a few serving as Foundation staff members paying forward the rescue they'd received. "Do you ever think about her?" William asked, though he didn't need to specify who her was. Lily nodded slowly, her reflection ghosting across the glass protecting the photographs. "Patricia died in prison 3 years ago. Heart attack, apparently peaceful, which seemed unfair given the chaos she'd created. I didn't go to the funeral, but I sent flowers with a card that said, 'I forgive you, but I'll never forget.' Her sister contacted me afterward, wanted to apologize for not seeing the warning signs, for not protecting Mom or me. We've had coffee a few times. She's nothing like Patricia. Works as a social worker, actually, specializing in domestic abuse cases. Turns out their childhood was a nightmare of neglect that doesn't excuse Patricia's choices, but explains some of the brokenness." "And how do you feel about that?" William asked, recognizing the therapeutic language Lily had learned over years of processing trauma. "Sad, mostly," Lily admitted. "Sad that hurt people, that Patricia could have chosen differently but didn't, that Mom died because someone's narcissism was more important than human life. But also grateful in a strange way, because everything that happened, all the pain, all the recovery, all the hard-won healing, led to this. She gestured at the photographs surrounding them, 3,000 faces that might have been lost. If I could go back and prevent it all, I would in a heartbeat. But since I can't, I'm determined to make sure those 3 years of hell produce decades of hope for kids who need it. The twins appeared in the doorway, David shepherding them toward the car, but Emma broke free to run back and grab Lily's hand. "Mommy, you said we could visit the shelter tomorrow and bring art supplies, can we?" "Absolutely," Lily confirmed, squeezing her daughter's hand with the gentle firmness of someone who understood that security came not from wealth, but from presence, consistency, and unconditional love. "We'll go right after breakfast." As they walked toward the exit, William noticed the small brass plaque mounted near the door, words he'd insisted on when the foundation building opened 15 years earlier, in memory of Rebecca Hartford, who taught us that love is the only inheritance that truly matters, and in honor of every child still waiting to be found. The estate's library had become William's favorite room in his advancing years, its shelves holding not just first editions and rare manuscripts, but the accumulated documentation of Lily's journey, school records, therapy notes, art portfolios, and the trial transcripts that had put Patricia behind bars. He'd been organizing these materials into a memoir, not for publication but for Emma and Rebecca and whatever great-great-grandchildren might follow, a record of how easily family could be stolen and how fiercely it must be protected. The final chapter, which he'd drafted just that morning, ended with a question he'd been contemplating since finding Lily in that shelter 20 years earlier. What obligation did wealth carry beyond accumulation and preservation? The answer, he'd concluded, was witness, the responsibility to see suffering that money often insulated people from noticing, to ask uncomfortable questions when something felt wrong, and to act decisively when vulnerable people needed protection more than they needed privacy or politeness. "I should have trusted my instincts sooner," he'd written. "The quarterly reports seemed fine, the emails were cheerful, but something in my gut kept whispering that Lily needed me. I ignored that whisper for 3 years, prioritizing decorum over urgency, and my granddaughter paid the price. The lesson I've tried to impart through the foundation is simple. When a child's welfare is at stake, intrusion is kindness, and verification is love. Better to risk offending an honest guardian than to abandon a child to a predator's mercy." The memoir's epilogue, still in rough draft, described the current state of trust fund reform and the work still needed, but also celebrated victories both legislative and personal. Lily's art had been featured in the Museum of Modern Art's permanent collection, her series on childhood resilience lauded for its unflinching honesty and ultimate hopefulness. The foundation had successfully lobbied for criminal penalties for guardian financial abuse in 43 states, closing loopholes that had allowed predators like Patricia to operate with impunity. And the Hartford family itself had expanded to include not just blood relations, but the extended network of survivors, advocates, and allies who understood that family was defined by commitment rather than genetics. Emma's painting from the gala now hung in William's bedroom, positioned where he'd see it first thing every morning, a reminder that the most important finding wasn't the discovery of fraud, but the recognition of worth. The moment when a forgotten child became visible again and someone with resources chose to act. The painting's light surrounded not just Lily, but also William himself. Emma's artistic instinct, recognizing that rescue flowed both directions, that the billionaire standing in that shelter doorway had been just as lost in his grief as the granddaughter he'd found there. On quiet evenings, William sometimes reread Patricia's final letter, the confession that had arrived from prison so many years ago, studying it not for pain but for pattern recognition, the warning signs he'd missed, the red flags he'd rationalized away, the small inconsistencies that should have triggered investigation. He'd incorporated these lessons into the Foundation's training programs, teaching wealth managers, lawyers, and family offices to recognize exploitation, but also teaching wealthy grandparents, aunts, uncles, and friends that their instincts mattered, that checking up wasn't paranoia, but prudence. The $2 million Patricia had stolen had grown through careful investment and William's contributions to $18 million, the amount now sitting in Lily's fully restored and carefully monitored trust fund, untouched except for the foundation's operating expenses that Lily insisted should come from the money that almost destroyed me but now saves others. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that Patricia's greed had ultimately funded the very reforms designed to prevent future versions of herself. Do you think she understood at the end what she'd done? Lily had asked William during one of their regular Thursday lunches, a tradition that had survived career demands, marriage, motherhood, and the simple passage of time. William considered the question carefully, remembering Patricia's rage at sentencing, her manipulative letters from prison, and the final heart attack that had taken her at 63. I think she understood that she'd been caught and punished, but I don't think she ever truly comprehended the damage. The childhood she'd stolen, the relationship she'd nearly destroyed, the trust she'd shattered. Narcissists rarely do. They're the heroes of their own stories, and everyone else exists only as supporting characters or obstacles. That's what makes the work so important, Lily had replied. We can't fix Patricia or the thousands like her, but we can fix the systems that enable them and rescue the children they target. That has to be enough. And it was enough, William thought, watching the twins play in the garden where Rebecca had once played, where Lily had slowly healed, and where future generations would build memories untainted by the darkness that had almost consumed their family. Emma was teaching Rebecca how to sketch the roses, their heads bent together over a shared notebook, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze like music. The billionaire who'd found his granddaughter in a shelter and asked about her $2 million trust fund had discovered that the stepmother's betrayal, while shocking, was ultimately less important than what followed: the recovery, the reforms, the relationships rebuilt and strengthened through adversity. 20 years later, the question wasn't what Patricia had done, but what William and Lily had created from the wreckage. A foundation that had saved thousands, a family that had healed and grown, and a legacy that would outlast any trust fund ever established. The real inheritance, William understood in his 9th decade, wasn't measured in millions but in moments. A great-granddaughter's painting, a daughter's forgiveness, a foundation's impact, and the simple, profound gift of family dinners where everyone present chose to be there, chose to stay, chose love over money and connection over comfort. Patricia had tried to steal that inheritance 20 years ago, but she'd failed in ways she could never have imagined, because the things that truly mattered couldn't be deposited in offshore accounts or hidden in shell companies or spent on yacht parties and champagne brunches. As the sun set over the Hartford estate, William raised his glass in a silent toast to Rebecca, whose death had started it all, to Lily, whose survival had redeemed it, to Emma and Rebecca, who represented its future, and to every child still waiting in some shelter, some foster home, some nightmare situation, hoping that someone would notice their absence and care enough to ask the right questions before it was too late. The money had been recovered, the villain had been punished, and justice had been served. But the real victory was simpler and more profound. A family, nearly destroyed, had been found and rebuilt and strengthened until it could help others do the same. That was the trust fund that would never be depleted, the inheritance that would pass from generation to generation, and the fortune that no con artist, no matter how skilled, could ever steal.